In this lecture, we'll be learning about Hebrew poetry. Through the lecture, I hope that you find out what Hebrew poetry is, its features, and why knowing Hebrew poetry helps your teaching, preaching, and of course exegesis of the biblical text. Hebrew poetry is everywhere. Once you start reading it, you find out that 1/3 of the Old Testament is poetry, so it's inevitable you will come across Hebrew poetry. While some books are predominantly poetry, like the book of Psalms or most prophetic books, even predominantly narrative books like the book of Genesis, the book of Samuel and Kings, these books will even have poetry or psalms embedded within its narrative. There's not a smoking gun, so to say, that distinguishes a poetry from narrative. But, in fact, it's an amalgam of various features that indicates that a passage you're reading might be in poetry. For example, poetry has different feel of language. There's a higher concentration of rare terms, specialized terms. In fact, you might be reading the book of Genesis fairly easily at this point, or maybe the book of Ruth or Samuel, these narratival texts. But the moment you go into prophetic texts, you're going to come across a lot of rare terms that you might have memorized or not used to. And not only that, not only is there a higher concentration of rare terms, some of the imagery or terms that are used in poetry have more figurative or metaphorical meanings. In addition to these rare terminologies, Hebrew poetry also have a different feel when you read it. That is, it has a rhythm. I would like to make a distinction between rhythm and meter at this point. Meter is maybe a feature when you think of like Old English poetry. That is, there is a certain syllable count that dictates how a poetry can be structured. For example, haiku, Japanese poetry, is a meter-based poetry in which there's 5 syllables on the first line, second syllables on the second line, and 5 syllables again in the third line. Of course, there could be slight variations, but not really. Most poetries are formed within these meter counts. Rhythm in Hebrew poetry, it doesn't dictate the rule. There's not a certain syllable count that the biblical authors had to follow. Nevertheless, the lines are generally shorter in Hebrew poetry. In fact, there's usually only 2 to 6 words per line in these, and they kind of omit certain filler words. For example, the relative pronoun asher is quite rare. The vaikto forms are fairly rare in Hebrew poetry, and also it omits certain particles or something like the direct object marker. In addition to these short lines, when there are multiple short lines, the relationship of the short line between the lines are characterized by what we call parallelism. Parallelism is something like rhyming. In English poetry, one feature is called rhyming, and that is similar sounding words. The repetition of similar sounds is what characterizes rhyming. But parallelism could be described as the rhyming of meaning. That is, they're going to use certain words that sound that mean something similar or mean opposite from one another. When you're studying Hebrew poetry, maybe reading a book on Hebrew poems and parallelism, or reading commentaries on the poetic books, it's very important that you know the terminologies, because there's set terms that are used in the guild to describe some things, and also sometimes these terms are inconsistently used by various scholars. But in this lecture, I'll give you kind of a top-down approach. First of all, there's the poem itself. Maybe in the book of Psalm, each poem is divided by chapter numbers. These are fairly common. But within each poem, there are what we call stanzas. And stanzas, or they also consist of 1 to 2 strophes. These are verse units made out of 1 or more cola. And what we call this colon or line is a single line that when there are multiple of them, they usually become what we call a strophe. So let me illustrate this for you. Here you have Psalm 1. Psalm 1 is a song on itself, or a poem on itself. So you would call this entire chapter a poem. However, at a closer look and analysis of Psalm 1, you can find out that this single poem divides into two stanzas. The first stanza focuses on describing who the Asherei Ha'ish is, that is, who is this blessed person. Whereas in the second half, you see a shift in topic. That is, now in the second stanza, it focuses on the identity and the fate of the Ha-Reshaim, that is, the wicked one. And you can see the concentration of this term, Rasha or Reshaim, the wicked one, in the second half of the poem, that is, the second stanza. Each stanza, both the first stanza and the second stanza, further divides into multiple strophes. We find that in the first stanza, it contains 3 strophes. Thankfully, in this poem, each verse represents 1 strophe. But please be careful with this. Not all versification is accurate or reflects the poetic division. So you want to be very careful and look at the biblical text itself rather than depend on versification. But in this case, you can see that there's the verse 2 reflects what we call a bicolon, that is 2-lined parallelism. So usually if you focus on the parallelism, that is the relationship between lines, you can start identifying individual strophes within each stanza. So I've been using this term parallelism. What is a parallelism? Here I build upon one of my mentors' work, David Toshio Tsumura, a very prominent Japanese evangelical Old Testament scholar's definition. He says, parallelism is the poetic device of expressing one thought through 2 or maybe 2 or more lines. Its 2 basic features are repetition and correspondence of elements, that is, sounds, affixes, words, and phrases between 2 parallel lines. It is thus a linguistic and stylistic device of poetry in which 2 or more lines constitute a complete sentence, and their elements correspond to each other semantically, grammatically, or even phonetically, with repetition and variation. The discussion and discovery of Hebrew poetry and parallelism is nothing new. In fact, it goes back centuries. Robert Loth is commonly identified as the first person who identified the importance of Hebrew parallelism. In his book, Lectures on the Sacred Poetry of the Hebrews, he identified 3 types of poetic parallelism. These I would like to specifically call semantic parallelism because what he notes is the repetition of the semantics, that is, the meaning of words. The first one is called synonymous parallelism, second, antithetical parallelism, and third, synthetic parallelism. Here's an example of synonymous parallelism. Synonymous parallelism is when the same sense, that is, meaning, is expressed in different but equivalent terms between 2 lines. Sometimes scholars will graphically represent this by A-B parallel A''B'. That is, A and B would represent different words or phrases or concepts, and the A' is corresponding with the A and B' corresponding with B in the previous line. In Proverbs 16 verse 18 we read, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Here you can see that A is pride and a haughty spirit. And here you see that these 2 terms are in parallel. They are very similar in meaning. And B represents before destruction and before a fall. Once again, both terms saying the same thing, but in different terms. The second type of parallelism is called the antithetical parallelism. Here, 2 lines correspond with one another by an opposition of terms and sentiments. That is, the first line states something and the second line says the exact opposite. Here again, you can graphically represent this by A-B parallel A''B'. Proverbs 12 verse 24 is such an example. Diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in forced labor. Here you can see that A and A apostrophe is diligent hands versus laziness. These are two opposing concepts. And B and B apostrophe is will versus forced labor. Once again, indicating two opposite ideas of ruler versus those who are ruled or who is serving. You can see these in two lines are in conflict with one another. And thankfully, a lot of Bible translations will reflect rightfully the use of vav here that precedes the second line as this disjunctive idea of but, expressing contrast. The third example is synthetic parallelism. The parallelism consists only in the similar form of construction, but word does not really answer to word and sentence to sentence as equivalent or opposite, but there is a correspondence in quality between different propositions. Here, Loth identified that structurally it seems like something's happening between two lines that are similar, yet they're not saying the same thing, nor is it disagreeing with one another. So it's kind of like a definition or a category for most other things. In fact, this became problematic. Most scholars did start using this as a catch-all for non-synonymous or antithetical, to a point that Tsumura in his book talks about. It seems like this third category is either really not really considered a category by most Hebrew scholars or scholars studying Hebrew poetry and parallelism. It seems like synthetic parallelism has become nearly meaningless. And I'll give you some example of how scholars disagreed with this category. James Kugel, who was formerly a professor at Harvard University, wrote an influential book called The Idea of Biblical Poetry, Parallelism and Its History. In this work, he actually said that Hebrew parallelism is not really about saying the same thing twice. In fact, the emphasis should be how a notion in A continues and is more developed in B, what he calls A what's more B. This here, Kugel is starting to shift the discussion from talking about the similarities between lines to noting how the second line adds to and builds upon the first line. Robert Alter, in his tremendously influential book, The Art of Biblical Poetry, also identifies and talks about how Hebrew parallelism is not simply repeating similar ideas or same things. In fact, there he identifies and describes what he identifies as this movement from the first to the second line. Is that this is one of heightening or intensification of focusing, specification, concretization, and even what could be called dramatization. In other words, he is calling scholars and readers of Hebrew poetry to identify how is the biblical author building upon and moving an idea. That is, they're not wasting space just saying the same thing over and over. That is, in contrast, the very purpose of rhetoric and repetition is to further clarify something, add information, or to intensify and communicate clearly a certain idea. My encouragement is that when you look at Hebrew parallelism, try to think in this way. How is the second line or third line building, adding upon, and clarifying ideas that is introduced in the first one? Here's an example of maybe intensification from Psalm chapter 1. We read, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers." We'll actually find out that the NIV translation doesn't really reflect the Hebrew sequencing here. It is an A-B, B apostrophe, A apostrophe, followed by B double apostrophe and A double apostrophe. Remember, these alphabetical letters is showing what words correspond with one another. It begins with the statement that this person does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. And then the following two lines, the second and third line, is focusing on the identity of this wicked person by putting it up front. That is, it is in the sinful way that you or this person shall not stand. It is in the dwelling place of the mockers is where those who are blessed, blessed should not sit. Focusing on the A element, you already see here a progression. Not only is the person beginning by walking, but this person is not standing, that is not spending time with those who are wicked. And finally, this person will not even sit and dwell for a long time with those who are considered wicked. You can see the movement from walking, stopping, and sitting down in the line and the movement of the psalm. Focusing on the B element, you again see a movement of intensification here. At first, the person is not hearing this, what we call the counsel, the atza, the advice of the wicked. It's almost as if you're maybe outside in the streets and you hear something and you choose not to listen to what you overhear. But not only that, now we're moving from maybe a random location that you heard something to the way, the path, this lifestyle of sinners. This, you see that there is an intensification from ear that something maybe you might hear in passing to an intentional path leading to somewhere. Finally, where does this path lead to? The dwelling place, this moshav, this dwelling place of the mockers is where this path ends. That is, now you're not simply doing business outside. You're not simply walking with them, but you're not going to go and live with them. There is an intensification that happens throughout this tricolon. For those who have had introductory exposure to the idea of Hebrew parallelism, maybe in an Old Testament survey course or in a hermeneutics course, they usually end and only learn about what we call the semantic parallelism, how the rhyming of ideas. Nevertheless, in recent years, there has been a lot of discussion regarding other aspects of Hebrew parallelism that might not be recorded or reflected in the English translation. And a matter of fact, you have to go to the Hebrew to really see these and understand these. And these other ways, including structure and grammar, is further bolsters the strong parallel ties between different lines. Here we're going to be talking about structural parallelism, and I'll introduce you only to three. First one, chiastic, second one, staircase, and third one, Janus parallelism. Chiastic parallelism is when the order of the terms in the first line is reversed in the second line, yielding an A, B, B apostrophe, A apostrophe pattern. This structure is actually often lost in English translation because maybe it doesn't make sense or the wording feels a little bit uncomfortable or unnatural for English speakers. A lot of people like identifying chiasm, even in Hebrew narrative or in Hebrew poetry, but seldom do they think about why there is a chiastic structure or what its intended purpose is. It seems like there are various functions as to why the biblical authors will employ a chiastic structure. These might be, one, to mark a literary unit that is, these things are meant to be taken as one whole. Second, to link components. It's saying, well, this idea of thought should be linked with this idea of thought by intentionally putting it as a literary unit. Third, it expresses maybe a merism, that is the totality. It talks about certain things in the first half and the second half, and together they're talking about, well, we're not talking about just two different components, but the entirety of this thing. Fourth, maybe express antitheses, that is contradiction or opposites. You can say something in the first half, but then when you repeat the idea in the second half, use it as a contrast, that these two are meant to be taken as opposites. And fifth, it might indicate reversal. That is, a certain process might begin in the first line, and in the second line, they're reversing the effects of this. Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 4. Here we read, "Announce in Judah and proclaim in Jerusalem." Semantic parallelism speaking, you're going to say maybe this is synonymous parallelism. Announcing and proclaiming sounds the same in Judah versus in Jerusalem, which Judah is the province and Jerusalem may be the capital city. But here you can see, in addition to its semantic meaning, there is a chiastic structure that is not evident in the English translation. We actually see that it's an A, B, B apostrophe, A apostrophe structure, in which right after B Yehuda, it says U B Yerushalayim, where these two geographical terms are happening right next to each other. Here, maybe this is both marking literary unit and talking about the totality. It's not saying that this announcement should simply be done in the country or region at large, but everything in between, little towns as well as in the wider country. Staircase parallelism is when some elements from the first line are repeated verbatim in the second and others are added to complete the thought. Here's an example from Judges chapter 5. Judges chapter 5 reads, wake up, Deborah. Wake up, break out in song." Here you see that the first element, that is A, wake up, is repeated both in the first and second line. While the first line identifies who is supposed to wake up, that is Deborah, the second line furthers the idea by saying, Deborah, what are you supposed to do after you wake up? Is to break out in song. Another type of parallelism is called Janus parallelism. Here, this type of parallelism hinges on the use of a single word with two different meanings, one of which forms a parallel with what precedes it, and the other with what follows. Thus, by virtue of a double entendre, that is a word having two ideas or meanings, the parallelism faces in both directions, that is both forward and backwards. This is a very unique parallelism that is often lost or overlooked in English translation. An example of Janus parallelism can be found in Habakkuk chapter 3. Here, we read, his splendor was like the sunrise, rays flashed from him. An example of Janus parallelism can be found in Habakkuk chapter 3. Here we read, his splendor was like the sunrise, rays flashed from his hand, where his power was hidden. But if you only read perhaps the English translation like here in the NIV, you just wonder, well, what does this mean? Rays coming out from a hand and then you find power in the rays, the sunlight? This is a little bit puzzling. Well, this is because the English translation is not able to show how the term rays in the Hebrew, that is karnaim, actually has two functions in this passage. Karnaim in Hebrew can actually mean both rays of sunlight, and the more common way that it's used is actually to refer to horns. Therefore, the karnaim is playing upon from the first line that talks about sunrise. Therefore, it describes the rays of the sunlight. But at the same time, by the virtue of double entendre, it also means horns. And when you think about horns, it is where God's power is hidden and seen. And this makes a lot of sense because in the ancient Near East, if you draw or depicted a deity, one thing that distinguishes a deity is by almost always putting horns on these divine figures, indicating the status and the power of the deity. Not only that, in biblical literature and extra-biblical literature, often the chief deity is compared to like an ox or a bull because, like horns, they are very powerful. So here you can see an example of Janus parallelism where this one word karnaim Because the English translation has to pick only one word, they pick raise, but it overlooks the nuance of this term, which it has, meaning horns. And because of this, sometimes the this function of the parallelism, Janus parallelism, is lost, and the meaning is also lost in the translation. In addition to semantic parallelism and structural parallelism, here I would like to also introduce you to what we call grammatical parallelism. Grammatical parallelism is another form of parallelism that is often lost or cannot be easily read or identified in the English translation. But if you read in the Hebrew, you can notice that how the biblical author wrote things reflects what they meant, and it contributes to the parallelism and meaning of these texts itself. Adele Berlin, amongst other scholars, have really built upon and studied this phenomena. She identifies that maybe within a line or even between lines, there is a contrast between noun versus pronouns, maybe using a pronoun or noun clause versus a relative clause, prepositional phrase versus adverse, substantive versus, these are noun or nominal forms versus verbs. Maybe there's a contrast in tense between a katal and yikto form. The conjugation, maybe a ko is used in the first line versus a nifl in the second line. Gender, feminine versus masculine. In numbers, maybe a line begins with singular references, but then the second line broadens out to the plural. Of course, there's the syntactic parallelism where there's a nominal clause versus a verbal clause, a positive statement that's made, then a negative statement, subject versus object. So these are various ways that, as long as you know grammar, the possibilities are infinite and multifaceted in how the biblical authors have used Hebrew grammar to help communicate their point. An example of grammatical parallelism can be seen in Psalm 24, verse 3. It reads, "Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place?" Of course, from a semantic point, you can see that both lines begin with this question. Both verbs are fairly similar, ascending versus standing. And then there's the mountain of the Lord versus his holy place. Maybe the second line, if anything, there is more of an intensification and specification, or maybe a progress. You ascend, then you stand at the holy place. You're going up the mountain in general, and then you arrive at the holy sanctuary. So maybe this progression and sequential idea. But the two lines is further intensified, or the parallel relationship is strengthened through grammatical aspects. You can see that I put an A, B, C, D here because there are a lot of components. A both begins with this interrogative phrase, me, who. Then, following the question, there is a verb in a yikto form. Who will go up, who will stand, followed by a preposition of beit, that means at, followed, concluding with a construct phrase, the mountain of Yahweh, the place of his sanctuary. Another very common grammatical structuring device that Hebrew poets use, it's called gapping or ellipsis. This is when an element in the first line, most often a verb, is missing in the second line. Therefore, the second line is dependent on the first. Let me show you what I mean. We have an example in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 15. It reads, "Drink water from your own cisterns, running water from your own wells." Here you actually see that the verb drink, sheteh, is missing in the second line. Nevertheless, we know that the second line must be implying and borrowing this verb from the first line, because the command is to drink, this time running waters, from your own well. The last grammatical parallelism, or Hebrew literary feature that I would like to introduce, is called vertical grammar. Vertical grammar is almost like ellipsis, in which it seems like the second line is dependent on the first line and is borrowing elements from the first line, but yet they differ slightly. Vertical grammar is concerned with the grammatical relationship between the lines, often a simple sentence being divided into 2 or 3 lines vertically. Here, what this means is that the first and second line are not saying two individual distinct things. Instead, the first and second line should be read as if it's one single sentence. The example of vertical grammar can be found in Psalm chapter 18, verse 41. Here we read, "They cried out for help, but there was no one to save. To the Lord, but he did not answer." Once again, just like ellipsis, you can see that the second line does not have a verb. Therefore, it is dependent on and borrowing the verb yeshavu in the first line. However, it's not ellipsis because not only is the second line depending on the first line is also dependent on the second line. When we read, "They cried for help," the question is, well, who do they cry out for help? The answer is to the Lord. Therefore, we see a vertical relationship between the first two components. These, "they cried out for help," and "to the Lord" comes as a pair. But not only do these depend on each other, the second half of both the first line and second line depends on this combination of the first half. That is, what happened when they cried out to the Lord? There was no one to save. When they cried out to the Lord, he did not answer. Here you see an example of vertical grammar that is often overlooked and untranslatable in English. Here, what we want to see is that both the first and second line depends on each other, and we should be reading these two lines not as two individual sentences. Instead, one single sentence and idea. This was just a survey of Hebrew poetry and parallelism. In fact, there's a lot more that could be said in various types. But if you like to read more about it and learn more, here are some 4 books that I would recommend. I think Robert Alterson's book is an excellent beginning to Hebrew poetry. He's the one who really talks about maybe the narrative and storytelling aspect of Hebrew poetry and parallelism. If you want to know a lot more about grammatical aspect or structural aspect, Adele Berlin's work is excellent. More recent treatment on these will be found in Elaine James' work as well as Dobbs Alsop's work. Dobbs Alsop especially, this is a standard book. It's a little bit more robust and have rich examples and really will talk about maybe the oral background of Hebrew poetry and how that might be reflected in the writings that we read.